Okay, so if you want to introduce yourself, then I think we will get going here.
Okay, sure. My name is Justin Perkins. I have a mastering studio called Mystery Room Mastering in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, United States.
Awesome. So on the EDM production Discord, we had some questions for you. So the first thing I want to start with is a lot of people want to know whether you use high passes on your master. If you do, then when do you use it? If not, then why don't you use it? So if you could walk us through that, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Definitely not on every project, and I know that some people might think you use it on every project. The reason is the high pass filter can sort of introduce phase changes at other frequency points, and it's one of those things. I don't know how old you are, but there's kind of a funny analogy. Is like when I used to watch cartoons as a kid, all these characters were get stuck in quicksand, and then there's a funny meme I saw that said, when I was a kid, I thought quicksand was going to be much more of a problem when I was an adult, and it's just really not. And the reason I say that is because I used to do high pass filtering a lot years ago before I had monitors that could reproduce such low frequencies. And what you realize is when you actually get a full range monitor system that goes down near 20 hertz, you realize that high pass is not necessarily necessary for every project. And usually you can have better results with more of a bell type EQ cut just in the problem areas. But depending on which EQ you're using and its filter types, you could actually introduce resonances at other frequency points in the audio material. So high passes can be a little bit damaging to the audio, really. So once you get a set of headphones or monitoring system that can reproduce all the way down near 20 hertz, you'll realize that it's not as big of a deal as you may have thought when you're using, smaller monitors that stop being accurate around, 40 hertz, things like that. I think a lot of people use high pass as sort of a safety net for what they can't hear, just to be sure. And again, I think that can do a little more harm than good. But, there are projects where I do use them. I just have to use my ears as to when it's appropriate. Probably my favorite EQ to do this with is the Dangerous Backs EQ, which comes in plug-in form and also obviously hardware. The plug-in is really, really great. It's usually on sale for under $100, I believe, quite a few times a year from Plug-in Alliance. So that's probably one of my favorite ones. I think if you use a high-pass filter in maybe some of the stock EQ plugins that come in some of the DAWs, it may not be as accurate or mastering grade when it comes to the high pass filtering. So you may introduce some weirdness in the low range by doing a high pass.
Okay.
I know that was kind of a long answer, but if you want to dig deeper into that, I can focus on some certain parts.
Yeah, could you walk us through, like, if you had a track where you did decide to use a high pass, can you just show us how you would start using it, what you would be listening for qualitatively? What may make you decide to shut it off when you're using it? Or any workflow type things?
Yeah, definitely. Well, like I said, I use the backs pretty much 100% of the time. And sometimes it's the software and sometimes it's the hardware. It depends how I'm working. But the backs has some fixed frequencies where you can do a high pass, like 12 hertz, 18 hertz, 24, 30, 30, 36, 43, and 54 is the highest one. I almost never do 54, although I actually did use it this week. Somebody sent me an acoustic guitar based album to mix, and didn't sound that great. And it was very direct acoustic. It was honestly not a great recording, but I ended up having to go almost up. I think I used 54 hertz, which is probably the first time I've used it. But there was just so much low thumping and rumbling from his guitar. And some of that I can take out with Isotope RX, but this is like a 70-minute album, so there's so much material that I leaned on the high pass a little bit to eliminate some of that stuff. But typically I'm in the 18 to 24 hertz range if I'm using a high pass. And I just need to make sure that it's not introducing any phase issues or frequency buildups, higher up in the frequency spectrum, like in the 60 or 80 hertz range, that it's not doing anything strange. So this is why I think using a bell type EQ down in that area can actually be more transparent. But of course, you have to have speakers or headphones that can reproduce that area to hear it. What else? I was going to say one more thing about this. Yeah, so that's, what I'm listening, like I said, what I'm listening for is build-ups and things like that. And what I was going to say is that typically I'm doing this before any limiting or any loudness, because even, let's say you have a track that's limited already and it's hitting 0, even doing a frequency, cut or a high pass is going to probably introduce clipping, and then you're going to have to relimit. And that's when it could start to sound pretty damaging and things go south pretty quickly. So for me, it's important to do this type of stuff when I'm at a more reasonable loudness and I'm not in danger of clipping. Hello.
So you're saying that you always make sure you do your high pass filter, and I assume any EQing before you set up your brick wall limiter?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, the limiting, usually the only thing that happens after limiting in my chain is the dithering at that point. So when you're doing this earlier on in the chain, some of the phase issues and level increases are not as big of a deal because I'm not at such a high, level overall, whether I'm in the digital domain or the analog domain.
Okay, that actually brings us to another question somebody asked. Do you have a preset FX chain, or I assume you have some hardware that you use that's usually connected in a specific way?
Right.
So what do you have set up when you start to work mastering on a track? Like, what are your key things that you always want to have ready?
Right, yeah, I do have a default effects chain, and not everything is on. I just have it ready to go at some frequency points that I really like and things like that, and some other settings. So that's what I love about Reaper is with the press of one key, I can insert sort of a default effects chain on all my items, which would be all my songs. And again, everything's flat. It's not doing anything yet, but I do have some things ready to go.
Could you show that? Can you show us that in Reaper right now?
Yeah, let me go back to a different session. This is one I worked on yesterday. Let me open up one that I've never worked on. That would make more sense. So here's a project that I need to start working on. And what I can do is, with the press of one button, insert this chain on that item. And this is all the stuff that I know I like and may want to use on any given song. I got the Dangerous Backs EQ, Fab Filter Pro L. Again, none of this stuff is set or doing anything, but they're set to common problem frequency areas.
Before you move on, what are those frequency areas that you're using in ProQ?
240, 150, 120, 60. And up here, 2.6K, 3.6, especially when you're doing, not so much with EDM, but rock music with electric guitars. Those frequency areas can get a little bit whistly or shrill. So typically these would be narrow cuts. And this, I don't use this too much, but this is like a 5.6K thing where I may do a little presence boost, but honestly, I would probably do that on my hardware EQ. I like to do EQ cut. I like to do subtractive EQ first, and then if something still needs to happen, then I might do some boosting. So that's that. I don't really use the high pass in ProQ, but it's certainly set to be enabled if I need something really extreme, sometimes just to troubleshoot. So another EQ that I can pop in and out is, this is a really great EQ for mastering, because it's, by default, it's like a mid-side EQ. Well, there's a few different modes, as you can see, left, right, mid-side. I just always use this in mid-side mode because if I want to clean up a little low mid frequency mud, I can do that in just the center channel and not affect things on the outside. If I need to add a little thump to the low end, I can do that in just the center channel. And this EQ is also great because when you start changing the frequency, it will kind of solo and isolate that band for you automatically. So it really helps you hone in on things that you want to either cut or enhance and boost. So this is a great EQ. Fab filter, multiband, and I have a saying that just because it's a multiband compressor doesn't mean that you have to use all the bands. Typically I use no more than 3 bands on this just to help solidify the low end. If the low end's feeling a little floppy, I can tighten things up a little bit with that. I used to have the Universal Audio Ampex tape machine, and as you can see, this is not enabled. Sometimes I'll just turn it on or off and see if I like it. I used to have the UAD one, but I recently just switched to, I really like this soft tube one. It's got a lot of great options, and it gives me a little less grief in Reaper, which I can talk about later. But I really like the sound of this. Again, it's not always on for every project. This is a really great plugin, Soothe, by, I think it's pronounced Oak maybe. I believe they're from Finland. But this is really great for just like, it's a great name for it, Soothe. It's just to sort of tame the high end. It could be sibilance, it could be overly bright percussion. It's a very fast, sort of like multi-band compressor. And this EQ is just sort of side chaining how it's reacting. So I'm boosting more high frequencies into it to help trigger it. Another really great one that just came out from Softtube is the Weiss EQ. And I just want to make sure I still have you connected here. Are we still live?
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm listening.
Great. Because I can't see the screen share app anymore. This is a really great plugin, and it's really interesting because it's not just a hardware emulation. I don't know if people are familiar with Weiss, but it's a Swiss company, and they're known for making very high-end digital, mastering products. So this is not just a hardware model. This is actually the software code that's in the hardware, because the hardware units are actually digital. So, they have digital ins and out. They have analog to digital and digital to analog to get in and out of it. And so this is the actual exact code that was in the hardware boxes, which could cost, almost close to 5 figures. I mean, I don't know the exact prices, but they make an EQ and a de-esser that are easily in the $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 range. And now we have the plug-in version for quite a bit less. So it's really nice to be able to have access to this and the exact same code that's in the hardware units. So this is great too, because it does mid-side mode. I use it quite a bit for de-essing, and I can de-ess just the center channel. That's often where the lead vocals live.
So hold on, I'm going to interrupt you real quick. When
Sure.
you do de-essing, are you primarily targeting the vocal, or do you ever use de-essing to target something else while you're mastering?
I was just about to go there. So typically the vocal is the main thing, but sometimes there's some sizzly percussive stuff in the sides, whether it's, electronic hi-hats or real hi-hats or other, like an acoustic guitars that are panned left and right and doubled. So because it's mid-side, I can dial in separate settings for just the side channels and, or, open up another instance of it. But it's just a really, really flexible tool. And what's cool about it is when it came out, it came with one other plugin, like just the limiter section, but on steroids. Now there's actually, when you buy the plugin, it comes with 4 plugins technically, and it has a special de-esser that I can show you. So it's based on the original plugin, but it's just kind of hyper-focused on de-essing. It reminds me of almost working like with Melodyne, but for de-essing. And it has 2 bands. And it's just so transparent and precise. Like, it's just great. So all this is happening before I go analog. So what I'm doing here is just kind of sweetening the audio to hit my analog chain. And, it has to be a certain level. Another thing I really love about Reaper. And then finally, and this wasn't always in by default, but this is made by Goodhertz, and, it has an elliptical filter. So if I want to mono my low frequencies, you can't see it, but I have a pretty great meter that, I forget what it's technically called, but it's made by Flux. It's called the Pure Analyzer, and it shows you a great visual of how your frequencies are panned. So it doesn't just show you the frequencies, but it shows you whether they're in the center or, panned. It's just really, really great to look at. And this Goodhertz, I think the Goodhertz elliptical filter sounds a little better than the one that you would find in the Brainworks one, because this also has a mono maker to mono. Now, people think you always have to mono the low end. That's definitely not true. It's pretty common to do for vinyl pre-masters. If you have a lot of stereo information in the low end, that it can cause problems. It doesn't always. So again, you don't want to do these things by default and just because you think you should. You always want to listen. And vinyl's we could do a whole nother session on just vinyl. But my point was, I really like the Goodhertz in general makes very good plugins. Unfortunately, they don't make a lot of mastering plugins. It's more like creative stuff, like a lot of mixing stuff, creative stuff for mixing. But this is actually pretty handy in mastering. I can raise just the mid channel. I can raise just the sides, and solo and mute just the mid or the side, which is kind of handy for troubleshooting. And every once in a while, I use the stereo width. So that's kind of my default chain. Now I do use other stuff. I can show.
Yeah, I was about to ask. Someone wanted to know if you approach different genres differently. So does your default chain change depending on, like, if you're working on a heavy metal track or an electronic track or like a folk thing?
It really doesn't, to be honest. If I'm doing something folky or sparse or a cappella, I probably won't use the analog gear. The more delicate it is, I think, the less likely I am to go analog. But anything that has drums and percussive stuff, whether they're acoustic or electric, mastering it's a little different than mixing. It starts to become a little genre agnostic, where you're really just listening and you can only do so much. You're working with a stereo mix, so it really doesn't faze me what genre I'm working on so much. I just kind of listen to it and react to it that's part of what mastering is sort of reacting to it more quickly, as if you were the listener, and what could be better or what's already great about it. Sometimes things need very little processing, sometimes things need quite a bit of work, so that it's hard to really approach it per genre. So I don't really have a different effects chain per genre, although I will say, and funny enough, I'm going to this is a somewhat new plugin called Dyne 1 by Leapwing. It's a multi-band compressor, and from what I hear, it was modeled after the multi-band in an older unit called the TC System, I believe 6000, which was used
6000.
It was used in quite a lot of mastering studios in decades past. It was kind of cutting edge. Some people are still clinging to them, even though they're getting a little archaic. But from what I understand, this multi-band compressor was heavily modeled after the one in there. And this sounds really great. I really like to use this on jazz, because with jazz, especially with an acoustic upright bass, you can get some pretty boomy low mids and lows, depending on the player and how the upright bass was mic'd. And this handles it really well. It has a lot of fun, parallel stuff. And the other thing I love about Reaper too, which with some of these plugins I do this, is every plugin insert has a wet to dry control, which is just amazing. Part of why I use it so much in mastering, because mastering is so subtle. It's a lot of subtleties. So sometimes I may like a certain plugin, but maybe I don't want 100% of it. And Reaper just makes it really easy to dial it back. So,
hold on, I'm going to interrupt you again.
Sure.
Somebody who was watching the stream was curious how you afford all your plugins. Well, obviously you're a professional. This is what you do. Your money goes
Right.
back into it. But for something like the Weiss DS1, I mean, that's a $550 plugin, which is way out of the range of people who want to work on their own music.
Yeah.
Is there alternatives to some of this stuff in your mastering chain that is perhaps cheaper that you find has been effective in the past?
Yeah, I would say, Tokyo Dawn Labs makes some pretty affordable stuff. Some of them are free, and then they have a gentleman's version. Let me see if I have any here. TDR Nova. This is like a dynamic EQ, so you could get some pretty similar results. I believe it has mid-side process. Yeah, it has mid-side processing, so you could do the sum. You put it in sum mode, and that's just the center channel, which is typically where the vocals live. So this is like a dynamic EQ, so you could hone in on. And it has a lot of great solo. You can solo. If I wanted to solo this band, I could do that. I could tighten this up and just hone in on the sibilance till I'm catching it. And it's an EQ, but it's also can be a dynamic EQ. You can dial in the threshold. So then only when those frequencies are exceeding a certain level will that kick in and act more like a multi-band compressor. So let's see if I can bring up the brand name here. Yeah, Tokyo Dawn Labs, TDR Nova. GE stands for Gentleman's Edition, and I think even that is very affordable, like well under $100. But
it's 50 euros. 50 euros.
Yeah, but you can also get there's a free version, and I don't know all the differences, but it's pretty effective. It's not like it loses your settings or mutes the audio. I mean, it's definitely usable. It's just that the Gentleman's version has some, you could probably read about it. But I actually teach an audio class at a college, and I have them install some of the free versions because they have Pro Tools and Logic, but they can't necessarily buy plugins for every machine. So these are some more affordable go-tos. Yeah, the Weiss one is fairly expensive. Like you said, I've been doing this for a while and I make a living at it, but I also do a lot of beta testing, which can kind of help. I don't. So luckily, when you beta test, you typically get a license for everything that a company makes, which is definitely helpful. But the soft tube, I ended up, the Weiss soft tube, I ended up, just purchasing that because as much as it seems like a lot, this is kind of the hardware version is sort of on every mastering engineer's dream list. So the fact that you can get it for $500 versus $8,000, it feels like a deal. if that makes sense?
Yeah.
It's just so sought after. And again, it's not an emulation where they had to model it. It's the actual software code that's in the box. So they're probably going to do that with, I'm not saying this with any inside knowledge. I'm just speculating that they're probably going to put out a software version of the Weiss EQ, which is also pretty sought after. I haven't seen any evidence of that yet, but you'd like to think that's where that's going. Let's see. FabFilter makes pretty affordable stuff that's really visually appealing. And back to the high pass thing, in the software world, DMG Equilibrium, which is kind of it has a pretty steep learning curve. It's got quite a few like under the hood settings, but you can do some really nice high pass filters in this plugin without it anything weird happening. But the Dangerous Backs, this usually goes on sale for under $100 from Plugin Alliance, and I think this has the best sounding high pass filters and low pass. Really, once in a while I do low pass things occasionally. It has some good shelves. So this is a really good plugin just to have at the start of the chain. But again, the high passing and stuff like that, I typically do that when I'm at a more reasonable level, probably first in the chain before any compression or limiting or things like that.
Okay. Were you going somewhere with that before I interrupted you? Do you remember?
I think I just asked if I had a default chain, and that's, again, I don't use all these plugins, but these are some common tools. This all happens before I have my analog chain. And I have this hardware, but this is another great I'm surprised they don't have it as a favorite, but the Vertigo, if I can only have 5 plugins, maybe it's it's under BrainWorks, that's why. If I can only have 5 plugins, this would definitely be one of them. It's the Vertigo VSM3, and I like it so much that I bought the hardware because I wanted to have it in a certain place in my chain, and the hardware version actually has 2 insert points for more hardware, which is part of why I bought it, because I needed more insert points. But what this has is 2 different distortion bands, second harmonic and third harmonic, and you can really hone in on the frequencies that it's distorting. This is another one that's slightly expensive, but it goes on sale for like $79 or $99 quite a bit from Plugin Alliance.
Yeah, just 2 weeks ago, $79.
Yeah, Plugin Alliance, they also have like this thing called the Pick Pack, which I think is for a pretty affordable price. Every month, I believe you get a certain number of plugins that you sort of rent to own. But anyways, this is a great plugin for being on a master bus, just to add a little excitement to something that's maybe a little too digital and sterile. And what's cool about it is you can solo the distortion bands. So you can solo the distortion. You can decide if it's going to distort the lows, the mids, high mids, or the full spectrum. You control how hard you drive it, and then you dial in how much percentage you want and the shape. You can roll off the highs of it. So it's a really, really refined, harmonic saturation tool that I've never seen anything like it. When it first came out, I sort of overlooked it because it just didn't make much sense to me. And finally, I just tried it, and it was like, it's so cool. I mean, I'm sure you could probably use it in a mixing context too, on like a bass guitar or your drum bus, but it works really well across the entire mix, just to add a little something, and you can have it affect the mids, the sides, or the left and right. So versatile. I mean, one thing that the hardware doesn't have, which I wish it did, is on the hardware you can't solo the distortion to hear what you're doing. I know a lot of people use the Decapitator plugin by Sound Toys, and I used to use that back in my mixing days, but it's a little too. It's not subtle enough for mastering, I don't think, the Decapitator, because it's just affects. It's just a little too brutal. It's great for like fuzz bass and distorted vocals, but on a mix, a little too aggressive. So this is kind of like a more refined version of that. So again, top 5 plugins easily. So I think where I was going with that is just let's see if there's anything else hiding. Occasionally I'll use K-Clip just to kind of level things off before going analog, but not very often.
So you use K-Clip before your hardware at the end of your software chain?
I have a handful of times. If something's got often I'll use that if the drums are like super loud, or the percussive instruments are super loud compared to the melodic stuff, and I can do that in my analog world too. But if it's a really extreme case, K-Clip is kind of nice for that, because it really kind of gently shaves things off a little bit. But again, not something I would commonly use. It's more of a once in a while, have it in my back pocket kind of thing. But let's see. I think that's basically it for this part of the process.
So after the software, you go out to your hardware. So I have 2 questions.
Sure.
Which hardware do you have, and the order of it? And do you feel that you could do an excellent job just using the software that you have without going out to your hardware?
Yeah, I do. In fact, if my studio burned down today, I'm not 100% sure I would replace all my hardware. It's nice to have. I think when a project is already sounding great and really well done, I think it adds another nice 5 to 10% of depth and space, and just a little something that the software can't get. But in reality, if I had to work with just plugins, I wouldn't be bummed out about that at all. It's just sort of a nice luxury to have the hardware. And I have had to do a couple. I think it was 2 years ago, I was traveling a lot, and occasionally a rush project. It was short trips, but occasionally a rush project would come up, and I would have to work remotely. And it's not ideal, but with the right headphones and things like that, all you can do is try, and things went pretty well, and I did that all in software. But as far as the hardware goes, let me go in order here. So I guess the first thing I have to help manage it all is these dangerous units called the master and the liaison. That prevents me from having to have a patch bay. I can literally just press buttons and things insert in and out. And it's really nice, clean connection, and it allows for instant A/B comparisons, because if you have to use a patch bay, by the time you get things patched in and things crackle and you get it all plugged in, you've kind of forgotten what the other version sounded like. So that helps me manage it all. But first in line is that Vertigo thing I showed you, the VSM, which adds a little harmonic saturation. And the other thing I want to mention about the high pass, what I learned is that tubes will emit a very low frequency oscillation. Most tube gear manufacturers filter that out for you without really mentioning it or talking about it. However, I bought this tube EQ called the Hendy Amps Michelangelo, which has become kind of popular in the mastering world. I replaced my massive passive with it. The Manley massive passive was just it was a tube unit, but it was so clean it didn't really feel like tube, and it was just like, if I want something to be tube, I want it to be a little more obvious. So anyways, I picked up this EQ, and I noticed that some really low frequency oscillations happening, and I talked to the manufacturer, and he said it's because he chose to not filter those out and let the engineer do that. So that's part of why my chain is set up this way, and I have the hardware backs EQ after that. So if I am using my Michelangelo tube EQ, which is like a good tone shaping EQ, I have the backs after it, maybe at 12 hertz, just to filter out low frequency oscillations from the tube. So that's kind of I wanted to mention that.
And so far, I want to, when you say you're high passing, you keep mentioning 12 hertz, 15 hertz. So when you're high passing, we're talking really low frequencies. A lot of people, I see a lot of people discuss mastering, and they're talking about 30, 40 hertz on stuff, and you're talking an octave lower than that, right?
Yeah, I think some of that comes in from trying to master on small speakers and maybe not the greatest room. Sort of like I said, fear of what might be down there. But really what I found when I finally moved to nice mastering speakers years ago is that there's not as much down there to be afraid of as you might have thought. So typically I'm addressing the stuff between 20 and 40 hertz. I'm typically addressing that with just more of a bell type EQ, whether it's the Brainworks or the Fab Filter EQ, or DMG Equilibrium, but just kind of a really narrow notch that I can hone in on where the problem really is, rather than more of a blanket safety net approach. I just think that's quite a bit more transparent sounding. And again, if I need to fix this, tube oscillation concern, that's more in the 12 or 18 hertz range on this back EQ. So yeah, it's typically very low because I don't want to induce any phase issues or have any other frequencies be more pronounced because of this high pass filtering, because it can definitely happen. And like I said, it's less of an issue earlier on in the chain when we don't have such high levels. But if you're already hitting a limiter and then you introduce a high pass filter, you're going to run into gain structure problems and have to relimit again, and then it's going to sound overcooked pretty quickly. But if you do it early on, it's the way to do it. So moving on with the analog chain. So I have a choice of 4 EQs, and I would never use all 4, but the main one is this Mazalek MEA2. It's a very precise EQ with 4 different bands. It's a parametric EQ. Has some shelving options, but I typically use it in peak and bell mode. Again, if I have to do more than a dB and a half or 2 dB of boosting, typically something's pretty wrong with the mix. I typically don't go into the 3 decibel range of any boosts. Occasionally I will cut maybe 2 decibels of low mids or mids, but again, that would be a pretty muddy mix. So these are all pretty subtle changes. And so I mentioned the Michelangelo EQ. It's a tube unit that has like an air band and high frequencies. It's a pretty great EQ. And that Vertigo unit allows me to blend it. So I don't always use it at 100%. It has a wet, aside from having the saturation stuff, that Vertigo unit has 2 insert points, and it has a parallel insert. So I can insert it to maybe 70%, and that's kind of usually the sweet spot. But if I need something more clean, I have this Mog. I'm not actually sure how they pronounce it, Mog or Meg. It's made in Utah, and it's the EQ4M. That also has an air band, and it's not a tube unit, it's solid state. So I can get some pretty clean. If I need some presence, I can boost the air band there. It has, there's a plug-in version too that's very close to it, but the mastering version has 1 extra frequency point that the plug-in version fails to have, unfortunately. But again, I don't use this on every project, but it has the sub, and the 40 hertz is great. I'm actually thinking of selling it. If anyone's looking for an affordable option in the hardware, there's a company from Australia called High Voltage Audio. They basically have copied this EQ but made it better. The tolerance between the channels is better, meaning the left and right is more matched. And instead of having to change the left and right channels independently, it's a lot like the Bax EQ, where both channels are controlled with 1 knob, so it's a little faster to dial in and recall. So I'm actually considering selling the Mog and going with this other one because of the better tolerances and the better ergonomics. So all those can be inserted with the Dangerous, and then once I feel good about that, I have basically 2 compressor choices. I have the Dangerous compressor for a really clean Swiss Army knife kind of approach, which gets used on about half the projects. And if I want something more colored, I have the Manley Very-Mu, because it's got a very silky sound to it. It has tubes in it. It can make something that's a little harsh just have a nice, little bit warmer tone to it. I try not to use that word warm, but there's something about this that just, it's pretty nice. And again, if I'm doing more than 1.5 dB of gain reduction on the loudest parts, that's about as extreme as it gets. I get a lot of my level with sometimes clipping the inputs of my converters, and then with some plugins after analog, which we can talk about, obviously a limiter, things like that. So usually I can, on my Dangerous, on the Liaison, I can quickly A/B which compressor I like better, the Dangerous or the Manley. And again, not so much for gain reduction, but I use these for the makeup gain. I use the output a lot of that. And then I believe last in my chain is my API 2500, which was actually my very first hardware compressor, because it's, in terms of hardware, it's somewhat affordable. And I've just kept it around. And I found that it might be actually a little too aggressive. And I think someone used the word grabby, and I think it's a great word for it. It is kind of grabby. But what's great about this Dangerous Liaison is it has a parallel blend, so I can insert it in its last, and then just do a little parallel blend with it, just to get maybe a little bit more average loudness out of, on my track. And even if the API sound a little too grabby, because it's in parallel, it's not as obvious, and it can kind of help solidify a track. I don't always use it on more delicate stuff, but anything modern, pop, rock, electronic, heavy, it's nice to just add in a touch of the API in parallel. And then the last thing in the chain is actually the output control of the Dangerous mastering console. And that sets my level back into Reaper. And depending on the style of music, I'm doing it less and less, but it's not uncommon to actually clip the inputs of the converters. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept at all. Some people claim they don't do it anymore. I do it a little bit, but the reason I don't do it a lot is because there's some great software limiters out there to get level. And also, clipping the converter can paint you into a corner if you need to make a good vinyl master, or if you just want to have a good archive for the future that isn't just clipped, then you're not stuck in that corner by clipping the converter. But for certain types of music, clipping the input can sound good. Like I don't suggest doing this with a average USB interface, like a Focusrite. That's probably not going to sound good if you clip it. But if you have a mastering grade analog to digital converter, you can usually clip it fairly hard, and it can sound pretty musical. And some people prefer that sound over a limiter, especially 10 years ago. Now, like I said, we have some pretty great limiter options that could maybe sound better than clipping the converter, but it's still a technique worth considering for some projects. So that's basically the analog chain. And before I talk about what happens after that, I actually have two converters that I use. I have the Cranesong Head, the Quantum, which is the new version, and I have a Prism Lyra. And the other cool thing about Reaper is someone made me this script. Does this zoom in when I zoom in? Are you seeing it zoomed in?
Nope, do not.
Okay, but you can still see Reaper?
Yes, I can.
Okay, well, I'm zooming in. So what I can do, I have a shortcut to toggle my two converters, so I can choose which converter I'm hearing without any disruption. And once in a while, usually a song will sound better. I'm talking slightly, but sometimes a song can sound a little bit better coming through the Cranesong Head versus the Prism, and I can decide which one is more appropriate for the song. And just another great thing. That's another reason why I like to use Reaper for this part of the mastering process, is all these little flexibilities. I don't know of any other program that could do that. So again, it just helps me determine the best converter for the project. And I can do the same on the way out. These blue tracks in Reaper are actually feeding my two converters, the Head and Prism. So I can, with the flip of a button on my mastering console, I can choose which converter is feeding the chain. So it's not uncommon that I like to use the Prism to feed my analog chain, but use the Cranesong Head to capture from it. And I can do that also very seamlessly with Reaper. So then to wrap things up, I usually just I really like the DMG Limitless limiter. And occasionally, a very common comment is it sounds great, but can it be louder? And in those cases, sometimes I like to use the Sonox inflator before the limiter. I think it's a pretty good tool for just getting things a little bit louder.
Well, I'm going to stop you on louder there, because we have a lot of questions about what you think about the loudness war and things getting loud, and what levels you aim for. So if you could walk us through that would be super cool. Sure.
I mean, I think it's becoming pretty common knowledge that the streaming services are adding loudness normalization. There's a great website called loudnesspenalty.com. Have you seen that?
Yep.
So what that does is you upload your mastered version, and it tells you by how many decibels your song will most likely be turned. Well, it tells you by how many decibels your song will be turned down, which in most cases is what happens with modern master material. The catch is that not all streaming services have loudness normalization on by default. They do not all normalize to the same target level, and they all use different means of measurements. And on top of that, for example, Spotify, sometimes if you're listening on the website, through Safari or Google, there's no normalization. If you're listening on your phone, it's on by default, and I believe the desktop app is on by default. Now, when we talk about Tidal, loudness normalization is on by default on your phone or mobile device, and on the desktop app, it does not even exist yet. So it's this big mess of, and then the big one, Apple Music, is not, they don't loudness normalize by default. The user has to go into their iTunes preferences and turn on what's called sound check, and that sets all the songs to the same level. So right now it's a really big confusing mess. So
do you have people like come up to you and be like, hey, I need a YouTube version, I need a Spotify version, I need an Apple version? Like, do you ever deal with that at all?
No, I don't get a lot of requests from my clients with that, but I see a lot of people on the various forums and Facebook groups thinking that they have to master their song to -14, and that's not really true. I think that you can go louder than -14. I think it's basically best, do what's best for the song, but don't go overly loud just for the sake of competing with something that may have been overcooked. We don't need to be in this competition stage anymore, I don't think. I mean, I never was that into it in the first place, but I understand why it existed. I remember the days of 5-disc CD changers, and you would have your CDs on shuffle, and the quiet CD would come on, and it just seemed kind of worse. But those days are long gone. So I don't get clients requesting that, and I actually don't believe in doing multiple loudness versions other than vinyl. Vinyl's a whole nother territory, but when it comes to the digital realm, I like to do one loudness version, because the problem is if I took a song and mastered it to -14 and then also mastered it to -9 or 8 LUFS, they're going to sound way different. The balance between the percussive and melodic elements is going to be completely different. It's going to confuse the artists, and they're going to wonder why does it sound not only a different level, but the characteristics are going to be way too different. So I'm not a believer in doing different levels. There's a good quote, the streaming service is normalized, so you don't have to, but it's just important to be aware of that. Going especially loud is probably going to result in, what they call a penalty. The one thing that happened to me about a year or two ago is somebody came to me. Their mix engineer was trying to master this track, and it was kind of a reggae-based pop track, and the artist was not happy with how it sounded on Spotify at all. So he wanted to hire me to master it, and I said, well, send me your previously mastered version. Let's see what's going on. And it was the hugest, loudest wave, one of the biggest, loudest waves I've ever seen, and it had quite a bit of low end, which is also an issue. I think it had too much low end, and they were going way too loud. And what was happening is Spotify was turning it way down, and there was so much low end that it was stealing headroom. So what ended up being the solution was carving out and shaping the low end to be more in control. I mean, there's still plenty of low end, but we carved out some notches that were too overwhelming, and we didn't master it insanely loud. And then after the normalization process, it actually still felt good. It wasn't getting squashed, and squashed is a bad word because Spotify doesn't compress it. It simply just lowers the gain, lowers the level. So I just think it's important to be aware of what's going to happen and the loudness normalization. But again, it's kind of a big mess because they don't all do it. YouTube has it on by default. There's no way to get around it. And I'm not a big YouTube user, but apparently it can take a little time for them to process it. So when you first upload your track, it may be at the same level you mastered it at, but then eventually they're going to run it through their system and normalize it down. So it is kind of a big, we're in this unfortunate transitional period, but I think when it's all said and done, it's going to be better, because then we can just master music so the song sounds good for what it is and not be concerned about a loudness competition, things like that. Because one thing that's sort of universally agreed upon is that when you find the sweet spot, when you find the loudness sweet spot and you loudness match the songs, the songs that still have some dynamics and transient info, they're going to actually maybe feel a little bit louder. They're going to feel better, easier to listen to, less fatiguing to listen to, because there's some actual dynamics and punch and movement, as opposed to just taking a brick-walled track and turning it down. It's kind of lifeless because all your transient information is shaved off. The meters essentially do not move. It just stays kind of static, and that it can be hard to listen to, and it can actually come off as sounding weaker or smaller. So I really don't subscribe to mastering to numbers. I think just be aware of the sweet spot and be aware of what's going to happen in the digital realm. And I still have clients that are putting out CDs because they're playing in clubs and bars and summer festivals, and they want a physical product to sell. But most of them are, in general, relaxing on how loud they care about it being, and they care a little bit more about the sound. So anyways, if anyone's not familiar, Loudness Penalty is a great website just to get an idea of what's going to happen. Again, I don't think you should master to -14 just for the sake of it, because it's honestly probably going to feel a little quiet in a non-normalized situation. But there is sort of a sweet spot and a balance that you can find when it comes to loudness.
So how loud do you usually end up being, and what type of metering do you use to reach that level?
Right. So the loudness, that actually is one thing that can be genre specific in mastering. I know we talked about plugin chains, and honestly, for the most part, use the same tools regardless of the genre. But loudness is a whole different story. If I'm doing a traditional jazz thing, -14 actually is kind of comfortable for old school, like traditional jazz. Whereas for maybe an electronic track or a rock band, that's probably going to feel a little too quiet. I'm still, 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, people were pushing me to get in the -8 and 7 LUFS range for some of the loudest stuff. And that's sort of relaxed to -9, -8 for the loudest stuff. If it's a Americana type thing that's acoustic based, but it has some obviously drums and things, I can get away with, -10 to -12. In some cases, I still get people that want it louder. What's interesting about electronic music is that you can actually, I think you can push it louder before you hear negative artifacts. If it's a track that's all like synthesized sounds, if there's not any acoustic drums and things like that, you can usually get away with louder levels before you hear these negative artifacts. So you could probably master an electronic track to -8, -7, even -6, and have it not sound completely destroyed. Whereas if I did that with a rock song, it would probably be very hard to listen to and pretty harsh. So there's something about that, and I don't know exactly why that is, but that's something I've seen. As far as meters, I have a variety of meters now. On the budget side, and I haven't actually checked this out, I just hear good things, but the U-Lean loudness meter seems pretty comprehensive, and I believe it's free, and they just came out with a new version too. That's probably what I would get if I was looking for something affordable. The problem is software like Reaper and Logic and Pro Tools, Cubase, the metering in it is pretty weak from a mastering standpoint. It's like, again, I teach some of these classes, and it's really, and occasionally, this happened the other day. I'm in a studio with a guy that does mixing, and he wanted me to check out his mix before mastering, and his metering is just so primitive and small and not detailed. I forget sometimes how, some mixing engineers are just, their metering is just not detailed enough for mastering. So if you're using an app like Reaper or something, you probably want to get something like U-Lean that's free. I'm trying to think. Waves makes the WLM, the Waves loudness meter. I use a handful of meters. Just from a purely visual standpoint, I really love the Doro meters. I can show you the Waves version. Let me just insert it on this track. So I wish I could, I don't have it. Let me see if I can play some music through here. Not quite set up to doing this, so it's not playing for some reason. Oh, there we go. Well, maybe I can jump back to this, but I love these meters. Just, these are kind of old school meters. They don't do LUFS, but it's just a good average loudness meter. And yeah, that's strange. I really should be able to see this because I can see them. Maybe there's a plugin that's killing the audio. Okay, here we go. So that's kind of what this looks like. And this is kind of quiet. Yeah, I mean, so these are just really, I love just my eyes and ears really work together with these. So I have the hardware version of my desk, but when I'm working from home, and before I had the hardware version, I used the Wave software version. Um, Again, they don't tell you the modern things like LUFS, but just great for average loudness and peak levels. I also use the Clarity M, which is a piece of hardware, just so I can have it closer to my eyes, because my computer screen is actually behind my speakers, so it's kind of far away, where I can have this little hardware meter on my desktop. But I guess my point was, when I'm finishing up projects, I'm actually using WaveLab, and that has very good built-in metering.
Can you show us the WaveLab metering? Why you think
Yeah,
that's better?
yeah. Let me just close Reaper, make sure nothing is. So let me find.
And for
This
what
is
it's
not.
go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I just did a video about free plugins, and I covered some metering solutions that are available for free that are very comprehensive. So that's on my website,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
most
Metering.
people...
Yeah, I mean, you always want to use your ears, but metering can be super important in mastering, and you typically need better metering than comes with like most multi-track DAWs. Like those meters are fine for making sure you're not clipping your tracks when you're recording and things like that, but doesn't tell you a lot in terms of mastering. And that's one thing I didn't quite realize till I did it. When I was transitioning into mastering and I was mostly mixing, I didn't know what I was missing. If that makes sense, I was like,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, like, whoa. So here's not especially loud. This is kind of what I was talking about. It's like an Americana master, but you can see the mixes are pretty dense. But up here we have, so this is not zooming when I zoom in. That's strange.
Yeah, no, it's not capturing the zoom, but we can see it fine. The resolution's fine. You can just
Okay.
point at things with your mouse.
Yeah. So up here on the right-hand side of WaveLab, we have LUFS, and there's three ways to measure LUFS. There's integrated, which is across the whole, either an entire song or an entire playback session. And then there's short term, which is a 3-second window. So you can see this changing more slowly. And then the momentary is like almost like a peak meter where it's just moving very fast. So there's three ways to measure LUFS. And it's a really nice way to measure your masters. What some people don't realize is that the LUFS spec has an EQ built into it that is really in tune with the human ear. I know RMS is probably a term that's familiar with a lot of people, but it's not necessarily weighted in terms of EQ. So if something has a ton of low end, it's going to measure quite loud, but it may not feel very loud. So that's kind of a shortfall of the RMS metering system, is that it doesn't always translate to how it feels and sounds, whereas LUFS has this EQ curve built in, and because our ears are more sensitive to mid and higher frequencies. So I do have LUFS meter in WaveLab, which basically mirrors my Duro hardware meters. This really helps me know where I'm going to be at when things are out in the real world, because that's kind of the whole point of mastering, is making sure it translates well to the real world, and that's not too quiet, not too loud, and obviously that the EQ and stuff is right. But this is just the kind of metering that is not built in. And I know you said you covered some plugins, and I don't know if you want to mention any of those now.
Oh yeah, just Ulean was one of them, like you said, and then there's DP meter version 3, which has full LUFS standard built in, and it's really useful. That's what I prefer to use because it's really compact. But that and Ulean work really well.
Yeah, so if you're not using like a mastering DAW, it's probably inevitable that you'll want to get some sort of additional metering plugin for mastering that does LUFS, and that shows you in more detail. I wish you could see my Flux Pure Analyzer. Maybe I can do that. Let me get a few things going.
So how do you like the Clarity M so far? Because I got one of those, and I don't know. I felt like it was superfluous, but I guess your computer's further away from you, so that's where the clarity comes in for you.
Yeah, exactly. In my old room, I was closer, but in my new room, I'm a little far away. Plus, I didn't want to mount another screen on this wall just for metering, like I had in my old studio. So it's nice that this little unit sits on my desk. It's less than 2 feet from my eyes. And the other nice thing about it is that it resets with each playback automatically, which you typically want in a LUFS meter because, especially with integrated loudness, you typically want to measure what you just heard, right?
Yep.
If the measurements are not resetting, your readings are not necessarily accurate, and that's one downfall of Studio One. Studio One has a mastering mode, but the LUFS stuff does not reset on each playback, which is really annoying.
I wanted to touch on something you said just a second ago, and now I have totally forgot what it was.
Okay.
Jeez. Oh yeah, that was it.
Okay.
You said having a second screen for metering. You didn't want to do that. So you feel that metering is so important that you would consider having a second screen in your studios simply for that?
Well, yeah, technically I do. So I have an iMac Pro, like we talked about. My iMac Pro screen actually has this Flux Pure Analyzer in full screen mode. And I was going to see if I can show you that. Can I show you?
I think you have to pull it over to your main screen.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I had the choice to show you screen 1 or 2 in these settings.
No, it only picks your primary screen in Discord.
Okay, so yeah, let me pull that up here then.
Yeah, because I feel when I talk to people, it feels like they don't understand how important metering is, and I wanted to help get that across that having good metering is really important.
Yeah, so that's your voice. I'm going to flip over to some music. So I can't hear you right now, but this is what some music kind of looks like on this Flux Pure Analyzer. I have this, they call it spatial spectrogram. So in the bottom, these red frequencies are the low frequencies, and we can see how much stereo information there is down the low frequencies. Not much. The low end is pretty mono. As we get up into the mids, it's getting wider. High mids, still pretty wide, and then as we get way up at the top, it gets narrow again. There's a vector scope, and of course some frequency stuff. So I'm gonna make this small again and make it so I can hear you again. But so, are we back? Can you hear me?
Test. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah. Were you able to hear what I was saying?
Yep. Everything went great.
Cool. So metering is very important. So I use my whole iMac screen for that Flux meter, and it's at a great place where I can see it kind of down low. And my main screen is actually a TV, a 55-inch TV. That's where my DAW sits. In my old room, I had a third screen for, I think I used a new gen LUFS meter. I had a couple meters on there that were in the playback process. I think Reaper calls it monitor effects chain.
Yep.
And Wavelab has something similar that is a great place to put these types of meters. And it's really important, like I said, that they are aware of your transport and that those loudness readings are resetting when you start and stop playback, so they're actually accurate. So yeah, my old room I had technically 3 screens. This room I have 2 screens and then the Clarity M. And I actually like it so much that I actually bought it for my home setup, which is, I think you're right, it's borderline overkill, but at home I do a little bit more post-production type stuff for a certain client, and it just helps me keep an eye on those. And I do that in Pro Tools, which has obviously terrible metering for mastering type stuff. So I like that I don't have to manage a plugin. It's just kind of there on my desktop. I can see the integrated loudness and things like that. So it is what it is. But like I said, the main thing is just have something that's enhances your DAW if you are trying to just do this all in like Reaper or Cubase, Pro Tools, things like that.
Cubase actually has really nice metering built in.
Does it?
for LUFS, RMS,
Okay.
PPM. It
Okay.
has a full built-in meter now. They took most of Wavelab's meters and brought those over, and I think like version 8. But
Oh, that's good.
all
That's
the
good to know.
other,
That makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah, majority of the other ones though, they're just pretty weak. And again, that's one thing I never really quite noticed because I was a Pro Tools guy years ago, like 10 years ago, before I shifted more to mastering. And I didn't realize what I was missing. I was like, holy cow, I was kind of doing this blind in a lot of ways. Those meters just don't show you much. So again, I don't master with numbers specifically, but they sort of help guide you and verify what your ears are hearing. And ideally, you know your mastering room well, and your speakers are calibrated a certain way so that you can tell, you kind of know where you usually have your level control for listening and how things feel and things like that. But yeah, meters are not to be undervalued.
something you said just a second ago brings us to a question someone asked. What made you switch from recording engineer to mastering engineer?
That's a great question. I'd always been interested in the process going back to like the early 2000s, but I never knew how it was done. And back then it was quite expensive to get into mastering, and it was very different tools than a recording studio would have. But I was always curious, like how do we get it from the multi-track? I was actually on tape back then. And then how do we get it to a CD where the songs are in sequence and everything's trimmed up nicely? And I was always sort of interested in that final product. And against my better judgment, I worked working at the studio was not bad judgment, but I worked at a studio up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. It's somewhat isolated, especially in the early days of the internet. It felt very isolated. In fact, we didn't have internet at the studio, which seems crazy now. But just doing a lot of like rock bands and punk bands, and they didn't necessarily know what mastering was, and the logistics of finding a mastering studio was not easy, and then the cost was kind of prohibitive to those types of bands, and I ended up just doing a lot of the mastering myself, which that is against kind of my better judgment now, because the monitors we were using, it wasn't a great place to be making mastering decisions. But I started just getting more interested in the process. I mean, we actually used a program called CD Architect back then. I was on PC. And it had the basics of laying out an album and all the songs. And I always had a passion for that part of the process, kind of the detailed stuff that people tend to overlook. And just started getting more and more calls for, like, because then my name would say mastered by me. And I started getting more emails and calls for just mastering, because this is as, Pro Tools and the Digio 2 were taking over, and people were starting to mix at home, but they didn't trust themselves to master it. So I started just getting more calls for mastering, and really continued to enjoy the process and dig deeper into what it really meant to master something. And kind of the tipping point was by this time I had moved to Milwaukee, and the main mastering studio in Milwaukee, the owner decided to move to the East Coast and said, hey, do you want to rent my room? I'm moving, but I'm not selling the building. So I fell into this really nice mastering room. It didn't have any equipment, but it was already built out. And that's when I decided to really invest in some mastering stuff. I think, going back to mastering with software, I could master with just software, but I could probably not master without this Crane Song Avocet monitor controller, because it just sounds so amazing to listen to music through this. Everything feels so clean and accurate and not colored. I mean, on the other end of the spectrum, like something like a Mackie Big Knob, I think the new ones are better, but the old Mackie Big Knob, it was just so colored. And the metering is literally like 3 dots. It's like quiet, medium, and loud, or clipping. It's not quite detailed enough to do great mastering work on, I don't think. So I invested in this Avocet, and finally I could hear. It was kind of like getting the correct pair of glasses finally, because I like to use that analogy for mastering, like trying to master on not great speakers in a not great room. It's sort of like trying to paint a picture with the wrong prescription glasses or really dirty, scratched up glasses. Like, it's really hard to paint an accurate picture. But once you get the right glasses, which would be like a nice listening room and monitors and stuff like that, it becomes very easy to dial in things. But back to the main question, eventually I just started getting so many mastering requests that I had to pick one or the other, because I found it very difficult to juggle mixing, recording, and mastering, because the workflows are so different. I can master an album comfortably in one day, whereas recording a record with a band, we're spending at least a couple days, usually a lot more, and then mixing a record easily a couple days, ideally like a week maybe to mix a record if it's got a lot of tracks. And I found those two workflows were butting up against each other, because I would have a band in to record or mix a record, and then I would have maybe something I mastered earlier in the week needs a couple revisions, but I have this band in for like 12 hours, and it was just, I had to pick one or the other. I was at this point where they weren't working out well together, and I just started saying no to recording projects, hoping that the mastering would continue to ramp up, and it continued to do so. And I, got, a combination of luck and a little bit of, but it's hard to have a strategy because you can't control if people want to work with you directly. You just have to do the best work you can and try to have the best communication with clients so that they keep coming back to you and referring you to their friends and people they know. So that's basically how I got into it. And I still learn things every day. It's not like I have shut off my learning. I'm always wanting to learn stuff, and learning Reaper has been a lot of fun the last 2 years, and it's actually it's sped up and improved my workflow in ways I never thought possible. So I still, I love Reaper for that first part of the process, but I do have to bring things over to WaveLab to finish up, because I just love this montage mode for finishing, doing the song spacing and the metering and the metadata, which is important with mastering sometimes, CD text. I know these things can be done in Reaper to some degree, but there's a lot of workarounds, and it's just, for me, it's faster and better to just move over to WaveLab to finish it up. And if I'm going to master something entirely in the software, then I start in WaveLab. I just use WaveLab from start to finish. But so did I cover enough ground there?
Yeah. The user had one extra question. I don't know if you can answer. Okay. He wanted to know about the guitar amp mic recording process in the Tarantula LP.
Oh yeah, pretty much what I do what I did for every record was just 2 microphones. It was probably a 57 or maybe a Sennheiser 609, I think, the square one. And then I probably used my Fathead ribbon mic, which is like a cheap version of the Royer ribbon mic. I've never owned Royers. I've worked in studios that had them. They're very nice, but just the combination of either the 57 or Sennheiser and the Fathead ribbon mic, which is a really affordable ribbon mic that still sounds good on guitars and drum room mics, because in those contexts, it's probably a little bit tricky to hear the difference between a Royer and a Fathead, even though they're several. A Royer is close to $1,000 and a Fathead's like closer to $100. But when you're blending those mics with other mics in a rock mix, it's less. It's not as easy to hear those subtleties. And then as far as preamps, I really love doing rock guitars through a Neve type preamp. So back then I had a Vintech, which is a Florida company, which is probably not far from where you're at. And Vintech Audio, they make some really nice Neve clone preamps.
Like the 1272, I think it is.
Not that one. I've used that. That's like got a blue face. I don't know what that's supposed to be, but I used to have a 473, which is 4 clones of the Neve 1073, and it didn't have all the EQ stuff, but it had the same preamp and some basic EQ. And I just love doing. I did pretty much every rock guitar I ever recorded is that setup. And then I probably didn't use any room mics on the Tarantula album because that's really close up front, like in your face, Marshall, amp, distorted guitar, pretty classic stuff. But for other types of music, I would also maybe throw a room mic out there as well. But Yeah, pretty straightforward. A lot of it is in the discipline of their playing. You know, they did all downstrokes like the Ramones used to do on guitar, and we just had a nicely set up and intonated guitar. I mean, all those little things add up to a bigger picture. So, nothing too special on that. Just
Cool.
trying to keep the signal as pure as possible. You know, I always did short cable runs and things like that.
Whoops, I backed out on the stream. All right, we're good. I had a question somebody just asked in chat. He wanted to know about your opinion on headphone or speaker correction software. Have you ever tried that? Do you have any qualms with using that? Do you think it might be useful for any of the people watching?
I do. We can talk about headphones for a little bit too. I have SonarWorks. I haven't used it in this room. In my old room, which was less ideal, I did go through the setup, and I mostly used it as a educational tool to see where my problem areas were in the room. Because what it does, for those who aren't familiar, is you run all these crazy tones through your speakers and use a test mic, and it doesn't take too long. But basically, what it does is it creates an EQ curve it's a plug-in, and it creates an EQ curve that sort of compensates for the deficiencies of your speakers and how they're placed in your room. And again, I just kind of used that to know where my problem areas were. It's tougher to use in mastering because of the headroom concern. So, you know, in mastering, we really need to be aware of the full range of everything. In order for SonarWorks to work, it has to drop the level down so that it has room to do these EQ corrections. Because like we talked about, even doing an EQ cut can cause clips and overs, which sounds kind of backwards, right? Because you're removing stuff. But the way the phase relationship works, you know, doing a cut on a mastered track could actually produce overs and clipping. So even just cutting, they have to lower the level. So there's some sort of mode in SonarWorks that lowers the level by the needed amount so that it can do the EQ adjustments and then not be clipping or distorted. That just becomes sort of a headache in mastering because, again, you need to know where that true ceiling is and how things are translating and calibrated. So I haven't, and luckily this room I'm in now sounds so great, and I'm getting such great results. You know, typically things are approved on the first or second try, and I've noticed a huge pattern since I moved into this room for a few reasons. But I think room correction software can be very useful if you're not in an ideal room, especially if you're mixing, because when you're mixing, the headroom is really less important. You just want to make sure you're not hitting zero. But like I said, when you're mastering, you're up against that ceiling, and that creates issues if you're trying to use SonarWorks. And I haven't tried the headphone correction software, but I can imagine that would be cool, especially because they can pre-calibrate that. You don't have to do any of your own measurements. You know, they know what the headphones are like for the factory, and they just create these profiles that correct it. And I saw one of the questions about headphones to use for under $200. And I think if you can go into the upper 200s, it's well worth it for the Sennheiser HD 600s. Those are like considered audiophile headphones, and that's a pretty good price for audiophile set of headphones. I don't know of anything in particular under $200 that's especially good. You know, I think at that point it's more about just getting familiar with what your headphones sound like. But I love the concept of the Sennheiser HD 600s because they're open back. I think those are more natural. I think those sound a little more natural, a little bit more like a speaker would. And I don't use the Sennheisers in my studio. I have the Odyssey LCD-X, which are a little more expensive. But it's the same concept. They're open back, and they're just so enjoyable to listen to listen on. And I don't necessarily make EQ. I don't really make EQ decisions on headphones. What I use headphones for mostly is quality control, like checking for clicks and pops, which I do quite a lot of actually, and remove them with Isotope RX. But I really think that I wasn't sure who asked the question, but if you can sort of stretch your budget out into the upper 200s, it's well worth it to get into a set of the Sennheiser HD600s. And again,
I interrupt you for that. The Sennheiser has HDXX on Mass Drop, which are the exact same headphones. You can get them for $200 straight up.
Yeah, I've been seeing ads for that actually on Facebook, but I haven't had time to look into it. But yeah, it's all about the design, the open back design and the fact that they go down so low. That's how my Audizies are as well, and it's great for, when I listen. After I print things into Reaper, I listen to every second of it and clean it up. Any clicks, pops, thumps, anything that isn't meant to be in there. That a lot of times that stuff slips through the mixing process, because especially if it's like how it should be, where it's not limited before mastering. Some of these things and noises creep out, during the mastering process because we're raising the average loudness. So headphones could be really useful for, finding anomalies and blemishes and things that shouldn't be in there. But yeah, so that's cool that you can get those for $200. I would highly recommend that, because the open back design is just so much more natural and less fatiguing on your ears than like something that's sealed. Now, obviously, open back design would not be good for recording because they're going to bleed out the side and go into your microphone, or, you wouldn't want to wear them at work and your office mates would be able to hear your music, but they're perfect for, supplementing your speakers. Now, if I was mastering in my apartment, I would probably rely on headphones a little bit more for tonal stuff. I think a good set of headphones is much better than a bad sounding room or, inadequate monitors. So, and there is actually a guy, his name is Glenn Schick, I think is how you pronounce it.
Yep.
He masters exclusively on headphones, and he can travel the world. He can actually travel to the artist's studio and master there, and the artist can make mix tweaks and they can talk in person. That's not exactly common, but it's definitely doable. It's something that I would consider doing at some point as well. I don't, but it's certainly possible to work on headphones. But back to the main question, I think SonarWorks is great. I'm not as familiar with any of the other ones, but certainly, again, you want to use it for reference. I wouldn't necessarily swear by it for every decision, but certainly great to flip it on and see how your material sounds with the correction on and see, where it's going. And again, I mostly used it in my old room to just learn where the problems were, because I really actually like the setup process and the way it measures things and the information that it gives you. So you could know, for example, if you have a boost at 50 hertz in your room, it's good to know that, so that when you're working, if something feels a little strong at 50 hertz, it might actually be okay, because it's your room that is making it seem too loud. Things like that. So it's good for education as well.
Cool. You mentioned RX, Isotope RX in there. Do you have a chance that you could just walk us through really quick with your workflow using Isotope RX?
Yeah, sure. Some people use the standalone app, which is fine. So, which means you can load an audio file into the editor and do your editing. I learned RX via Pro Tools, and Pro Tools has what's called Audio Suite, which is something I think that's one of the few things I miss about Pro Tools. It's basically like an offline processor. You can open up a plugin, and it's offline. It's not inserted on any particular track. You basically just highlight audio on the timeline, and it processes that in real time. And through the use of playlists, you can get, the original version back. So it's not like you're damaged. It's actually destructive processing, but if you use playlists, it's not actually destructive, because you can flip back to the original take. But I can demonstrate to you how I use it in Reaper. I have it set up as, and I don't know if most of the people on this forum like to use Reaper or not, or if it's kind of...
Everybody knows about Reaper because I talk about it constantly.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I'm just, I think I'm a little over 2 years in now, and I can't imagine going back. So like I said, I have a couple demo sessions I made here, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to let you hear it. We didn't think that far ahead, but the reason that these songs have these little edit points is because I'm opening up copies in Reaper. I'm opening up copies in RX from Reaper. So this big red track would be my capture from analog. And the reason that I do it here is because if I remove a noise and the client says, hey, you took out that noise and I loved it, I would say, instead of having to redo through my analog gear and a big headache, I can just a couple of clicks and I got the original audio back. So that's why you see these edits here. And here's a really good example. I mastered a track, and I take out all sorts of noises like clicks. Mouth clicks drive me crazy. The lip smacks. Once you start hearing those, you can't unhear them. Like I take out so many of those in mastering, and that's just become part of my process now. I don't even mention it. I just do it, and I occasionally get comments like, "Oh, I love how you clean up all those mouth noises. I thought I was going to have to live with those." So, mouth noises are one thing. Clicks happen from bad edits, digital clicks from clocking errors. But this was a unique one that I remember. I mastered this track. It's this kind of interesting mix of like African stuff, but it's like more indie rock. A lot of bass elements. But this guy, after I mastered it, he thought that. So, you know how like when you get an email, your computer makes a bloop noise or a beep or whatever?
Yeah. Yep.
He was convinced that he accidentally had his computer on when he was like doing his vocals and he heard like this beep in the background, but he couldn't find it. And what happened was the bass is kind of distorted. It's basically just string or fret noise from his bass that got really magnified in the mastering process. So what I do is I listen through. I'm going to put a marker. I'm just going to remember this time, 6:14. So what I do is I listen through, and when I hear a noise, I can just highlight it and press a button. This first one's going to take a minute because RX was closed. But now I have a copy opened in RX. I could, let's say this was a problem click. I could run the declicker, and now that click is gone. If that's a problem, I can do that. I just save and close it. And when I flip back to Reaper, I have copy of, the fixed copy is down here, and that's the active take. So then I would just keep listening. And if I heard a problem here, highlight it, press my key command, and now I'm in RX where I can hear it and address the problem. If that was a noise, I could get rid of it. It's super fast. Then I just save this file, close it, and back to Reaper. And now I have what I like is that the fixed version is active. And then again, if someone said, hey, you took out this noise that was supposed to be there, I can flip back to it in a second. And then the other thing I can do is I can redo it. So if I was too aggressive with it, I can just flip back to the original, try again, do the fix, close, save and close it. And now I have, it's just, to me, that is so fast. But this one I wanted to show you, you can actually see pretty well. I believe it was here. No. Losing it now. Let me check my notes. And if you have any specific questions about RX, let me know. But I like to just do it part by part because I don't want to process the entire song because I don't want to do any damage. A big part of mastering is, do no harm. So
I'd like to split off on that because I was going to try and ask you that later. But since you mentioned it, two people were asking about mastering, quote unquote, for tone or mastering invisibility. So do you ever take any creative liberties when you master, or are you really on like the do no harm train?
Typically there, that's where I start from. I did a project earlier this year. It was kind of a retro rock thing where, I don't know if you remember the band Jet from like the early 2000s. They said, we really love this Jet album. And it's a really organic, they might have done it on analog tape at a nice studio in LA. And they said, we want our record to sound like that. And I listened to it because I hadn't heard it in a long time. And I usually hear it on the radio where it's hard to judge what it really sounds like. But listen to it in my studio. Then I put on their mix, and it didn't sound bad, but their mix was definitely done like, all plugins, probably recorded with a USB interface. It just sounded extremely digital and clean. Like technically not bad or anything wrong with it, but it had no vibe or character. So I really leaned on this Vertigo piece that I showed you guys early on,
The
which
the VSM3.
yeah, which the plugin honestly sounds really good too. So I hit that. I use that a little harder than I normally would, just to add some saturation and roll off some of the. I saturated the mids a lot. I didn't saturate the highs because the recording was just this really pristine, squeaky clean, sort of smiley faced, where the lows and the highs are boosted and not much mid range. And if I would do that on most projects, people would be like, what'd you just do? It sounds way different. But for that project, it worked really well because they gave me a reference point that was actually pretty far from where their mix was. Honestly, the funny thing with mastering is, like, half the projects you do, if you sent it back sounding radically different, they're happy. And the other half, if it's radically different, you've totally ruined it. So understanding what they're going for is a big part of it. I try to ask if they have any references that they're shooting for. And when I ask for mastering references, it's typically for tonal balance and loudness. Typically, all the obvious creative stuff is taken care of in the mix. I don't look at it as being creative by default. Like I said, if I have a reference to shoot for and the mix is not really close to it, then I can dig in a little deeper. But a lot of times I take things for face value and just say, okay, here's their mix. They were probably very happy with the mix in their mixing environment in their studio. I need to take it, and especially if it's the EP or an album, I need to take all these songs and just get them on the same page so that they sound good in general, but also work well together as a group of songs. And that's kind of my approach. I don't jump in thinking I need to put my stamp on it or anything like that. I think that's more of a mixing thing. I think mixers and producers get hired because they have a certain type of sound, but I think by the time it hits mastering, it should really have the style. I've had people tell me to master something like a country album, and I have to say, with all due respect, like, there's nothing I can do to your project to make it not sound country at this point. It's got the steel guitar and all that stuff. I'm not going to be bending genres or styles here with mastering. It's just trying to keep it true to the source, but translate well. And the biggest things that come up are low end problems, because I think a lot of things are mixed nowadays in smaller studios and houses, basements, bedrooms, and it can be a little bit hard to accurately hear the low end. It may sound actually really great in your room, but if your room has low end monitoring problems, there could be low end things that are getting past you and aren't necessarily audible. So I think a lot of the correction I do happens in the lower frequencies, and once that's done, things tend to fall in place pretty well. Sometimes I will add some high ends, some presence, but definitely not by default, only if it feels dull. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah.
Or if you want me to touch on anything, but I really don't get creative unless people ask me to. I can count like 2 times where someone asked me to add reverb in mastering. It's typically a bad place to add reverb is in mastering, but for whatever reason, they had me do it. I think it was a case where they couldn't. It might have been a live to stereo recording. For whatever reason, they couldn't revisit the mixes, and they just wanted a little more ambience. But again, that's almost never happens. I guess we could talk about stem mastering, because from what I understand, that's pretty popular in the EDM world.
It's mythically popular, I think.
Okay.
I've talked to a bunch of mastering engineers and mixing engineers. Like, I know a lot of people, and they just say, no, that doesn't really happen. But then, all the people are talking about it regardless. So
Yeah, well, that's good. That's refreshing. I try to avoid stem mastering at all costs, because to me it's still mixing. And I have one client that I do it for regularly, because I made an exception because his mix engineer had some kind of illness. They were not quite done mixing, but the mix engineer was unable to finish the mixes. And basically what the artist wanted was he wanted the music a little brighter and more aggressive, but we couldn't do it on the stereo mix because the vocals would become too sibilant and aggressive. So what he did is he sent me just 2 stems. He sent me all the music and then all the vocals as separate tracks. And I was able to, like, you know, make the music more aggressive and brighter with EQ and then not harm the vocals. And basically he just continues to send me stems, and I've made that exception, but usually, and then there's been a few other exceptions, but the first thing I do when I get stems is I just blend them in, usually Wavelab actually, but it doesn't matter. But what I'll do is I'll just assemble the stems and I'll send it back to them as a stereo mix and say, is this your mix? Do you like how this sounds as a mix? And then I'll master the stereo version from there. I don't really like to master entirely from the stems. You know, I like to create a stereo mix. I'll create a stereo mix from the stems and do some slight adjustments, usually because that allows me to do some de-essing directly on the vocals, which is always nice instead of having to do it on the stereo mix. But again, unless I'm specifically asked to get creative, I definitely do not. I don't just do it for just to do it. And it's funny, this summer I was at a music event and someone was giving a mastering talk, and they talked about using vari-speed to like speed up maybe the chorus by like the tiniest amount. And I just could never imagine doing that. Like if I just sped up someone's track in the chorus by a BPM or two, like I can imagine they wouldn't be happy about that. And especially if they had already started making the music video and now the file's not in sync. So yeah, I definitely don't do things like that. I did have one client that wanted me to speed up a song by like 2 beats per minute, just globally. And with RX, with the algorithm built into RX, you can get away with a few BPMs change without too many artifacts. But once you try to go too far, it's obviously going to sound a little glitchy. So again, these are not things that happen very often, but they have come up. But typically it's not, for me, it's not a extremely creative process. It's a little bit more about translation and quality control and things like that.
Cool. I mean, I think that covers a lot of people because you know, we have a lot of users that their mastering is part of their process. You know, they have an EQ and a compressor and a limiter on their track while they're mixing it and writing it because, you know, they don't really have much of a choice. They're doing it by themselves. And I'm sure when you were mixing, you worked that way. I think everybody's worked that way eventually. I think a lot of people want to get creative with that because they don't separate the mixing and mastering stage as much as they probably should. So I think that's where that question stems from.
Yeah, it's turned into mix/master. I see that all the time on the forums. I'm looking for someone to mix/master my project, and I still consider them 2 separate processes, but I know that they're sort of blending. You know, I'm lucky where I'm lucky to just stay in mastering world. I haven't mixed anything in a while, and I'm just getting stereo mixes. So again, I tend to take them at face value, where I assume that everyone's happy with how it sounds, unless I get special notes.
That's a question I have because I haven't been in a mastering studio to do any work in a while. I do all mixing and tracking work. You said since you got mastering speakers, you hear things in a different way. Do you think if you went back to mixing, that would affect how you would want to work? Like, would you still work on near field monitors, or would you want your mastering set up if you were doing mixing, tracking work? Like, how do you feel about that?
I probably would. A couple years ago, I did try to mix, and I did actually mix a couple things on in this mastering setup, and it was a little bit challenging, and I don't think I did my best work. And it was one of those things where it was a client I've worked with, you know, for a while. They just really wanted me to mix it. They didn't care that it took me a long time to get to. So I made an exception, and I did mix on here, and it was a little bit challenging, to be honest. If I was going to go back into mixing, I would probably pick up some near field monitors and probably have a separate room for that, or have things set up a little differently. So And on the flip side, I have a home setup now, and I picked up some near fields, and I have such a hard time making mastering decisions on those. So
Which near
it's
fields are you using at home?
um, I picked up a pair of the Focal Shape 65s, and they're not bad. I would actually probably like to listen. I like listening to stuff on them, but I have a hard time making decisions on them. I don't know if it's just those. Um, I'm looking to replace them with some small PSI monitors, which is the same brand I use in my mastering room, but like, a smaller version. Because I do a little bit of work from home. Sometimes I might do most of the work here at the studio, but I'll transfer it and finish it up at my home studio. Things like that. If just save me a little time, or if it's bad weather, or if I need to be at home for something else, I can still get things done. So, but it's been pretty eye-opening to go backwards to near fields and hear what it's like to try to master on those. So that's why, when I do use those, I'm not necessarily mastering. It's typically where I'm doing my listening for clicks and pops on headphones and things like that. I can do that kind of work at home, because that can be a little time consuming. Not so much to fix the problems, but listening through everything in real time. That could take a little while. So, anyways, mixing, yeah, I would definitely go back to some near fields for mixing. And part of it too is, yeah, just this being so far from the speakers and mastering. I mean, it's great for mastering to get the bigger picture, but certainly harder to make mixed decisions. I really do. That's part of why I believe they are making them two separate processes does have some value. I know that not everybody has the budget for that, but I've found that doing mastering in this room, I just could be so confident in my decisions, whereas, I don't have to go out and do the car check and checking on all these different systems. Typically mastering studios don't have multiple sets of speakers. They just have one set that just sounds very good and natural, a flat response. So you can just really trust what you're hearing. Whereas I think some mixers, they'll get a few different sets of speakers to get different perspectives, but also to maybe compensate for their room. They might have, a room where certain speakers behave differently in certain frequency ranges, and having a couple sets of speakers gives you a different perspective to help make decisions. But again, you're in a sense, you are somewhat guessing, and then you still have to do your car check or your outside world check. So anyway, getting a little off track, but did that answer your question about
Yep.
speakers?
I think that's pretty good. Oh, do you remember what you were going into before with RX, or did you feel comfortable with having shown your workflow there?
Yeah, I can't. My session's getting a little messy, but it was basically this distorted bass with some string. When you move your fingers on the strings, it makes like a bloop, and it just popped out so much in mastering that he thought it was, like I said, he thought it was like a background noise, and I was able to just simply. And again, I've lost track of it now, but I was able to just open up RX and highlight it and draw it and paint it out basically, and it was totally gone. He didn't have to send me a new mix, but it did jump out. It was pretty jarring once he pointed it out. I can see why he thought it was like something else, but so that's kind of my RX workflow. It's just, and the other, this is way messier than I usually just I'll go to a different song. Typically it just looks like this, just one extra take. But what I like about this is if you do it in RX, you can't really see where you made your edits in the standalone app. If you do it in Reaper, now I have a map of where all my edits were. And this happens a lot. If this artist would have to send me a new mix, then I know exactly where all the fixes are. Because I have to redo those RX fixes, right?
Yeah. I was gonna tell you something real quick. I think Raymond Redette, ex Rame on Reaper, I think he has a script that can color your previous takes so that they can be colored better, so you can recognize them better.
Yeah, I should look into that. Right now, it's just the same color. Now,
Yeah,
if I
I
if
was
I
thinking
do a
that could
new,
get confusing.
yeah, I guess I'm used to that. Now, if I do a new recording like I did on this project, this was a case where the song cut off at the end. He had to send me a new mix because um, his bounce didn't go long enough. So now when I do a new recording, it actually is a different color. See, the first take
Yeah.
is red, this one's blue. But when I just do item copies to go into RX, yeah, they are the same color. I should look into that to see if I can do that. So, and this is actually a song where the artist did send me a new mix. That's why we got red and purple, but that's getting a little off track. But that is a big part of mastering, is getting new mixes. And in the world of just working in software, it is a little easier to just pop in the new mix to your session, and all your settings are the same. In the world of analog mastering, it's a little more time consuming because you have to reset the analog gear and then re-record the song in real time, or songs. So what seems like a simple fix, I've had people say, but all I did is like I unmuted the backing vocals that were accidentally muted. Such a small change, but whether it's a big or small change, it's still kind of a long fix in the analog mastering world, because if it's a 5-minute song, you gotta print that in real time, plus some other odds and ends. So, that's one thing that I try to stress to clients is listen to the actual mix files before you send it in for mastering, because as you may have experienced, something can sound right on playback, but when you do like an offline render, sometimes a plugin can go crazy, not operate properly. You get a glitch or dropout,
Yep.
and a lot of times people don't listen to those actual bounce files. They just they bounce it, send it in for mastering, and then that's when they discover rendering problems. So I would say, it's definitely not uncommon to get at least one new mix file when I do a record, because they missed the problem that they had to fix on their end. And it's not always a creative problem. It's more like I sent you the wrong version of the file, or for some reason the backing vocals were muted, or it cut off too soon. I mean, sometimes it's obvious problems, like that one I caught. I said, hey, you should check this file because it cuts off before the song was done sustaining. But other times it's problems I would have no idea, like if a backing vocal's missing, like there's no way I could just listen to a song and know that. So anyways, it's good to just listen to the actual files that are created before you send it out to mastering.
That is a very good tip, and that is something I've had a lot of problems with. When people send me stuff to mix, and I get stems that are in rendered tracks that are just like, they obviously didn't check stuff. It gets kind of frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the
Go ahead.
offline, yeah, it's just the offline process is so different than live playback. And as a Reaper and Wavelab user, these are not primary DAWs that plugin vendors are testing. I have a feeling the main plugin developers, they test Pro Tools, Logic, and Cubase, and they probably don't spend as much time testing Reaper, Wavelab, Studio One, things like that. So if you are a user of a lesser common DAW, you're probably more likely to run into plugin issues that, again, they may sound fine on playback, but when you actually do a render, they may not be processing correctly or at all. Could be all sorts of glitches, like you mentioned. So it's good to actually just check those files.
I had one more question for you, and
Okay.
after, if there's anything you want to discuss or talk about, we could go into that. But what do you think is the biggest misconception about mastering in 2018?
Well, I think not specific to 2018, but I think that mastering is just making it louder, and there's more to that. It's more about how you make it loud, and there's a difference between measured loudness and perceived loudness, because I've had cases where I'm mastering a project and the client says, it needs to be loud. Doesn't sound loud. and it doesn't sound as loud as this other thing I'm comparing it to, and I'll check it out, and technically we can master something louder, but it doesn't feel as loud. And I think a big misconception is that mastering is solely responsible for loudness, but actually the loudness potential of a song or a track comes from the performance, recording, and mixing process. That's where the loudness potential is sort of made or broken, because it's certainly not hard to get things loud anymore with a limiter, but if the source is just not there and sounding right, if the frequencies aren't managed correctly, if there's a lot of low end buildup stealing headroom, it can measure loud on the meters, but it's not going to feel and sound loud. So I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions, is that mastering is responsible for loudness and mixing is not. Because yes, well, we do make it louder in mastering, we can only do so much. You can't make up what isn't there. You can't make a bedroom recording a drum set with 2 mics sound like, and a mediocre drummer sound like it's done in a professional studio with many microphones and drum samples and things like that. So I just think a lot of the loudness potential of a mix of a song comes with actually in the recording and mixing process more than people realize. And in mastering, then we eventually just hit this point where we get diminishing returns, where going louder is going to actually, it may read louder on the meters, but the song isn't hitting you and feeling as loud and translating as loud. So that's kind of the biggest misconception, which can tie into my feelings about Lander, if you want to hear about that.
That question was in there. I wasn't sure if you wanted to attack that one or not, but if you're ready for it, go for it.
Yeah, I actually wrote an article about it for Pro Audiophiles that anyone can read if they're interested in. And my problem with Lander is not the sound of it. I actually sent a pretty decent mix to it, and it came back sounding, fine. It didn't totally destroy it. Side note, since I wrote the article, somebody did an interesting test though on the mastering forum, because let's say I mastered a song and then somebody sent it back to me like a month later to master it. A human mastering engineer would listen to it and say, well, I don't think it needs any changes, right? But if you run a song back into Lander again and again, it still applies processing. So that tells you that it's doing some amount of just preset guessing without, it's just reprocessing it. Whereas sometimes a mastering engineer may do nothing. They might say it needs absolutely nothing because that's already good to go. So that tells you something about Lander. But my biggest beef with Lander is that they call it mastering, because there's more to mastering, such as, sequencing of the songs, the CD text, the metadata, things beyond there's the stereo processing. If you're doing digital and vinyl, there's things that you do differently for those 2 formats. If you're making CDs, which I know are pretty much dying, but honestly, I still make plenty of CD masters. So there's all these like little detail things that are still part of the mastering process that Lander or any computer is just not going to do for you. Especially listening for clicks and pops, like I showed you. I actually spoke with one of the main people at Lander, and they said that comes up a lot, where people will process their tracks through Lander and complain that there's a click at the start or something. And actually that noise was there in their mix. They just did not notice it until it was, the average loudness was pushed louder. So that's something that if a human's mastering it, they would hear that and remove it, or tell the mix person that they should probably fix that. But again, with Lander, it's not going to tell you about these little problems. So I know that's splitting hairs to some degree, but that's the reason it bugs me they call it mastering, because there's no things like that. And I don't know if it's a beta thing, but I thought I saw Lander has something now where you can sequence the songs online on their website, but I don't know if that was like a upcoming feature. But at the time I wrote the article, that Lander did not do that. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. I don't think the processing is always terrible, but I think it's always going to have some amount of guessing to it. And that whole loop back test tells you just that, like if Lander process your track to where it's great, if you send it right back to it, it should do nothing, but it still does stuff. So what's it really doing? How is it making these decisions? There's definitely some analysis and thinking going on, but then they're still just kind of throwing presets at it and things like that. So that's kind of my thoughts on Lander and those automated services.
Besides Lander, there's stuff like the Isotope Master Assistant and other there's other plugin developers who have plugins that try to like automatically balance the spectrum and set the loudness, and then they give you control over that. Like, how do you feel about those, like I don't know what you call it, like mastering setup products that just like set you up to work on a master?
Yeah, I think the Isotope one is cool. It can definitely help you if you don't have an ideal listening room. I think the Isotope one could get you in a good starting point. And kind of going back to the genre thing, I don't know if people have used or if you use the Isotope. I think it's in Ozone. The spectral balance assistant.
It's in Ozone and Neutron.
Yeah, maybe I can bring it up here. I actually don't use it, but I think it's a cool, tonal balance control. So I'll hit play on this. We'll see what happens. Isn't there a different view? Yeah.
Yep.
Like I said, this is a very bass-heavy project. It's like African indie rock, basically, like African rhythms. It's mostly bass guitar and low drums. So that's why it looks this way. But this is actually a cool. They analyzed, I think, about 10,000 songs and came up with this frequency curve that you should be within, on average. And they thought they were going to have to do it like per genre, but they really only came up with 3 categories. They came up with bass heavy, modern, and orchestral, because they found even between hip hop or indie rock, the frequency distribution was actually quite similar across many different types of genres. Like mostly the era might dictate that, like whether it's from the 60s or 80s or 2000s, but it was all pretty consistent across the board. So I think this is a cool, again, you don't want to rely on it, but if you're working in an unfamiliar situation, I know some producers go from studio to studio and might not have a good reference point of what a certain studio sounds like. So I think this is I basically just view this as a meter, like, trust your ears, but you can use this in conjunction with your ears. So I think the tonal balance control is cool. Any of the presets that come up, I would take them with a little bit of a grain of salt, because again, every song is different, but I think they can get you in the ballpark or help you feel confident that you are in the ballpark, depending on how you're using it. So I think those things are fine. I just think there's some things that need a human touch. Another thing, going back to the Lander thing, would be noise reduction. If I have a song that has a little too much hissing noise at the start or end, if it has a quiet intro and I'm hearing some hissing from equipment or an amplifier or tape, or even like a plugin that has the tape hiss simulation, I don't apply noise reduction to the entire song. What I do is apply it up until I can't hear the noise anymore. It could be the first 5 seconds, could be the first 10 seconds, things like that. Because I don't want to process the whole song. But a song, this is not uncommon, where maybe I'll take a sample. This ties into mixing tips. If you're setting out to be mastered, it's a good idea to leave a couple seconds of any noise or room tone before or after the song, because whoever is doing the mastering, if they have a couple seconds of that room tone or the equipment noise, whatever the noise is, if they have a few seconds of that, they can use RX to sample the noise and tell RX what the noise is, so it can do very transparent noise reduction without damaging the music so much. Some of the cheaper noise reduction options, they just have too many artifacts to sound usable, but RX can actually be very, very good. But a common scenario is a song that starts out quiet, gets loud, has a quiet section in the middle, and then it ends kind of quietly, at the tail end after the last beat, and everything's fading out, sustaining out. So I would probably just apply noise reduction in just those couple spots where it's necessary. That way I'm not harming or, applying noise reduction to the entire song and potentially creating artifacts. So those are things that like just computers are not capable of understanding right now. It's like in the case of noise reduction, which parts of the song actually need it and what is too much, like when is it going too far? Because typically when I'm doing noise reduction, I'll crank it up until I feel like there's too many artifacts, then I'll back off a little bit, and that's usually the sweet spot. And so that's another thing about automated stuff. So anyway, I think that's a good tool, the isotope stuff, just as a good starting point. And
So with tonal balance control here, like, and the thing you pulled up, there's that like peak at like 410 hertz or so. Like, would that concern you? Like, would you?
It would. This is a very atypical project. Like I said, this is a very bizarre project. So I can't hear it. I did this a few months ago, but obviously I left it in and the client was okay with it. It seems like it's specific to that song. I wish I could describe this better, but it's just a lot of weird low hand drums and bass guitar and African rhythms. So I'm not actually sure what that is, but I did see what you're talking about. It didn't concern me enough to cut it any more than I already did. So again, this just is not the best example to be maybe demoing the plugin with, but again, this is just a guideline as well. So it's not like it has to stay within there. Just a little bit of a crutch.
Were there any more of the questions that you saw in Discord that you were interested in answering that we didn't cover?
Let me flip back to that. How do I get to that?
I think I covered basically everything. I think we went over everything.
I think you did too, yeah. I would say just back on the subject of loudness, again, we're getting to a point where the overall loudness is less critical. We can we can basically just do what's best for the material, and people are always going to adjust their playback level. When you sit down to listen to music wherever you are, typically you adjust the playback level to suit your environment. So it's not as big of a deal. And I would say when people are in the mixing phase and they are comparing their mix to something that's mastered, I would avoid the temptation of over limiting or even limiting at all if you're going to send it out for mastering. And if you're a user of iTunes, you can turn on sound check and compare your unmastered mix with something that's mastered. That's going to basically turn down the mastered version to match the level of your mix, and then you can just compare your mix. It's more of an apples to apples comparison. Like then you're just deciding if it sounds good or better or similar to what. Otherwise, if you compare your unmastered mix that isn't limited to something that's mastered, the mastered one's always going to seem a little more in your face and powerful and better just because it's louder. So turning on sound check in iTunes will help. It will eliminate that loudness difference, and you can just judge it for how it sounds. And this is also true for judging masters, because now we're entering this era where slightly less, where our masters are not quite as slammed as they used to be on average, but we still have a situation where people are referencing stuff that was mastered 5-10 years ago where it was slammed. And even if you're comparing your mastered track to something else that's mastered, I would suggest turning on sound check, because then you can hear the actual sound and make sure that you're not squashing it too much, and that you still like how it sounds because sound check will also basically simulate the loudness normalization of the streaming services, right? Because it's making all the songs the same volume. So you're going to kind of hear how it sounds when it's turned down and normalized to sit with everything else. And sometimes artifacts of over limiting and things like that can really stand out when you listen to it in that way.
That is a very good tip to use that, especially since a lot of people don't even have iTunes or anything installed. It's actually a very useful feature.
Yeah, it's one cool thing about iTunes is sound check. Other media players might have something similar, like replay gain, stuff like that. But the whole point, and then there's even some plugins now, like I think it's called Magic AB, and Plugin Alliance has Metric AB, but it allows you to load in reference tracks and it will level match them for you. And that's really the best way to compare the sound, because you don't want to go down that rabbit hole of chasing the loudness of something else and ruining your song just to be loud. Especially again in the era of loudness normalization, it's actually going loud can actually, like the loudness penalty website shows you, you'll actually get turned down and it can actually seem weaker. And there's a plugin called Perception, designed by a guy named Ian Shepherd, who also does mastering, and that's another way that you can sort of compare your before and after, and it's level matched. So it allows you to bypass you insert it in a certain way, it allows you to bypass all your plugin processing and compare your before and after mastering chain, but it's level matched. So you're not saying, oh, my unmastered one's quieter, so the master one must be better. It's actually, I don't know exactly how it works, but it basically allows you to compare your before and after processing of your track at the same level, so that you're taking the loudness out of the equation and confident that all your mastering decisions are making it better, not just louder. So
Yep, that's very important to do, especially when mixing as well.
Yep, exactly.
If you would like to tell people more about yourself once again, because I think we're about to end the stream. And another thing is give people an idea of how much it would cost to do like a 5-track EP or a 10-track EP if they wanted to contact you. Like, a generalized quote, because I know you have a quote thing on your website that they can use. I don't want you to get spammed by a bunch of those just from people watching. So.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't have my rates memorized. That when people ask me, I go to the website and look at it. And I can bring it up here. Okay, I don't use Chrome very often, but I think it's saved here. So yeah, you can just put in the number of songs. It starts at $200 for 5 songs, but then we have things like if you need a vinyl pre-master, if you need instrumental mixes mastered, if you need ISRC codes, there's all these little variables that you can check off. If you want high resolution versions, I am of the opinion of I like to upsample everything to 96K if it's not already there. Let me start over. If something is 88.2K, I'll work on it there. But when things come in at 44.1 or 48, I will upsample. And obviously, the upsampling does not improve the sound, but I do think my analog chain performs better and the plugins sound better at that sample rate. And I use a very high quality sample rate converter by Weiss called Weiss Sericon. And it's very transparent. I wouldn't want to do this with the built-in sample rate conversion of like Pro Tools or Reaper or Logic, because that would probably do some damage. But if you're using a nice sample rate converter, it can sound really nice. And no matter what sample rate your project comes in at, I always have the ability to give you 24-bit 96K waves, which can be handy for mastered for iTunes. I know Tidal is starting to stream high sample rate stuff. So again, we just have all these options. So what I like about this is people can tell me what they need for their project, and they can click this part, and they can tell me all the track titles and all the details I need to know. It really cuts down on the number of emails that we have to send back and forth. It's like I get projects all the time where it's somebody I've never been in contact with. They just randomly send me all their information, and I can get started on the project right away because I have all those details. There's a place to upload the audio files. So yeah, if you go to mysteryroommastering.com, here's the main page, and you can listen to, if you have Apple Music, Spotify, or Tidal, you can click on these to listen to a playlist of stuff I've done. I'm always updating that, but the main big blue button here, you click calculate a project, and it allows you to go to this page where you just type, you can see what it's going to cost for all these variables, how many songs you have, how long, if it's a really long project, the cost goes up slightly, not much, but it basically gets all these questions out of the way so I can get right to work on your project, and I'm not sending you 10 emails to get all the details, and then things don't come up later, like, oh, we needed ISRC codes, can you still add those? And it's like a month later. It just kind of covers all these bases right away. It's pretty common to get MP3 files from me, even though obviously we submit WAV files for the digital distribution masters. People like to have MP3 files with all the metadata and artwork embedded, which I can do easily. It's part of why I use WaveLab, because it's all very automatic and time saving. I don't have to use another app and painstakingly enter this stuff in. So people like to have those just for sharing with friends and promotion and stuff like that. It looks, basically the MP3s look just like they would if you purchased something from the iTunes store, and it has all the artwork. Everything looks great and professional. So that's basically it. Feel free to email me if you do have any questions. There's a contact form. I'm always on Facebook or stuff like that to chat. But this page makes it pretty painless to send in projects. Like I said, I get stuff, especially from overseas. I get stuff in the middle of the night, and it just makes it real easy to send in your project whenever you're ready. You don't have to I see some mastering websites where it says contact me for rates, and it's like a lot of people don't have time for that. They just want to know and get it done right away in this fast-paced world. So I try to make it as painless as possible to get things started. And I should say one more thing. I also I know singles are becoming more popular, so I also have a single song mastering page that's a little more simple. Just a couple questions, but the artist name, song title, do you need ISRC codes? And it's much more straightforward. With the album submission page, you don't pay anything until you are satisfied with the work. So I don't send an invoice until everything's completely done. For some reason you're not happy, you never even get an invoice, and we just go our separate ways. With the single song page, just because it's such short, quick turnaround projects, that this page does collect payment up front just to save me some time and whatnot. But the other page, because it's more of a financial commitment, that I don't do any invoicing until you are fully satisfied with the work. I like to have trust with people. I see some studios that need some or all the money up front, and I think that sends out a message of distrust, and I've been fortunate enough to not have any issues working this way. So that is that. If there's any other questions, let me know. Otherwise, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and maybe I could do another more focused one sometime in the future, like on just certain aspects of mastering. But that's a good overview anyway of mastering process.
Yeah, I think that's good. I thank you very much for spending this time with us. I will have this video put on YouTube, and I will list your website and whatnot as well. Okay. So if there's anything else you want to say, we'll end the stream. And there's a couple things that I want to talk to you after we end the stream as well.
No, I think we've covered a lot. So let's call it good, and we'll go from there.